I felt the starlight on my tongue before I understood what it meant, cold and metallic, like licking the edge of a blade that had been left beneath the moon for 1,000 years, and Master Azur told me it was the first sign of true comprehension, this ability to taste the cosmos itself, though I did not yet understand that what I tasted was not enlightenment, but the beginning of my unmaking. The halls of Raya Lucaria smelled of old parchment and something else, something I could not name then but recognize now as the scent of transformation, that particular sweetness that clings to flesh when it begins to forget what shape it was meant to hold. And I walked those corridors with the others, young scholars in blue robes that whispered against stone floors worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, each of us believing we were chosen, special, destined for the kind of understanding that would elevate us beyond the mortal coil. They brought us to the upper chambers where the light from the lake below fractured through crystalline windows into 1,000 dancing fragments, and there, amid the geometric patterns cast upon the floor, we were taught to see the primeval current, that force which flows through all things, connecting star to stone, thought to matter, and I felt it for the first time like a river of cold fire running just beneath the surface of the visible world, and I reached for it with hands that still remembered how to be hands. Master Azur stood before us with his head transformed into a great crown of stars, his humanity already half devoured by his own genius, and he spoke in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, telling us that to truly grasp the cosmos, we must first unmake what we believe ourselves to be, that the human form is merely a suggestion, a temporary arrangement of matter that clings too desperately to the illusion of permanence. And I listened, and I believed, and I opened myself too, the current like a flower opens to rain. The application process had been brutal, I can say that now with the clarity of hindsight, though at the time it seemed merely rigorous, a necessary culling to ensure only the most dedicated minds entered the Academy's halls, and I had answered their questions for 3 days straight, mathematical proofs and philosophical queries and strange riddles that seemed designed to measure not what I knew, but how I thought, how my mind bent around problems, whether I possessed the particular kind of curiosity that burns hot enough to consume common sense and self-preservation alike. My family had been proud when the acceptance letter arrived, sealed with blue wax and written in script so elegant it seemed to shimmer on the page, and my mother had wept, and my father had clasped my shoulder with a grip that spoke of hopes he could not articulate, and my sister had looked at me with something between admiration and sadness, as if she knew even then that I would not return the same person who left, and she was right, of course, though none of us could have imagined just how profoundly correct she was. The journey to the Academy took 2 weeks by foot and wagon, winding through hills that grew progressively stranger the closer we came to Lake Liurnia, the grass taking on an odd phosphorescence in the twilight, the trees twisted into shapes that suggested intelligence, or at least intention, and the other students in the wagon with me spoke in hushed voices about the wonders awaiting us, the secrets we would unlock, the power we would wield, and I joined in their excitement, their naive enthusiasm, never suspecting that power and wisdom are predators that devour those who seek them too eagerly. The first experiment was simple, they said, a minor realignment of the flesh to better accommodate the flow of sorcery through our bodies, and I lay upon the stone table in the ritual chamber, while they chanted in languages that predated the Erd tree, their voices weaving patterns in the air that I could almost see if I squinted just right, and when they pressed the glintstone against my forehead, I felt it sink into my skull like a hot needle through butter, and the pain was exquisite, clarifying, a bright white agony that seemed to burn away everything unnecessary until all that remained was pure consciousness, witnessing its own transformation. The stone was warm when it entered me, pulsing with its own rhythm that did not match my heartbeat, but seemed to be trying to synchronize with the organic machinery of my body, and I could feel it sending tendrils deeper into my brain, microscopic threads of crystal weaving themselves through grey matter, connecting neurons that had never spoken to one another before, creating pathways for thoughts that human minds were not designed to hold. I woke 3 days later with thoughts that moved too quickly, racing along pathways that had not existed before, mathematical concepts blooming in my mind like strange flowers, and I could see the formulae now, hanging in the air around people and objects, describing the fundamental architecture of reality, and I laughed because it was beautiful, so beautiful, and I did not notice that my fingers had begun to elongate, the bones lengthening in ways that anatomy texts did not account for. The other students congratulated me when I returned to the dormitory, their faces bright with a mixture of envy and anticipation for their own procedures, and I tried to describe what it felt like, this expansion of consciousness, but the words kept slipping away from me, the concepts too vast to compress into the crude vehicle of language, and I settled for saying it was worth it. Whatever came next would be worth it. And they believed me because they wanted to believe, because we had all come here seeking something we could not name but recognized when we glimpsed it in each other's hungry eyes. The meals in the great hall tasted different after the first procedure, not better or worse, but more complex, as if I could perceive flavors that had always been there, but my previous sensory apparatus had been too crude to detect, and I could taste the minerals in the water drawn from the lake, could identify the specific combination of herbs in the soup by their molecular signatures rather than their aromatic profiles, and I wondered if this was how the gods experienced the world, this overwhelming cascade of information that made simple acts like eating into profound revelations about the nature of matter itself. We gathered each evening in the study hall, those of us who had undergone the first procedure, and we compared our progress, the ways our perceptions had shifted, how we could now see the invisible threads of magic connecting all things, and Therese showed us how she could move objects without touching them, just by understanding their position in the current and suggesting they might prefer to be elsewhere, and we applauded, and we did not speak about how her eyes had begun to glow with in a light that never dimmed, even when she closed them, even when she tried to sleep. Sleep itself became strange after the procedure, less a loss of consciousness than a shift in focus, and I would close my eyes and find myself drifting through landscapes that existed only in mathematical space, walking along curves that describe probability distributions, climbing surfaces that represented the relationship between energy and entropy, and when I woke I would be exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical rest, as if my mind had been running calculations all night that my conscious self was not privy to. Master Lusat visited our study group one evening, his body already halfway to crystal, light refracting through his partially transparent torso in ways that created rainbow halos on the walls behind him, and he spoke to us about the nature of transformation, how the human form is merely a chrysalis stage, a temporary container that must be shed if we are to achieve our true potential. And his voice had a quality like wind chimes, each word ringing with harmonics that spoke directly to the glintstone embedded in our foreheads, bypassing our ears entirely and resonating in our skulls. He told us about the primeval current, how it flows from the stars themselves, carrying the raw stuff of creation, and how the ancient astrologers had learned to tap into this flow, to draw power from the cosmos itself. But they had made a mistake, he said. They had tried to remain human while wielding forces meant for beings of pure consciousness, and the contradiction had destroyed them, had torn them apart from the inside, and the only way to truly master the current was to stop clinging to the illusion of humanity and embrace what we were becoming. I asked him what we were becoming, and he smiled, or at least his face shifted in a way that might have been a smile if faces were meant to be translucent, and he said we were becoming conduits, channels through which the universe could observe itself, and was that not the highest calling imaginable to be the instrument of cosmic self-awareness? And I nodded because it sounded profound, sounded like something worth sacrificing for, and I did not yet understand that conduits are hollow things, that to let something flow through you means emptying yourself out first. The second experiment required more, they told us, a deeper integration with the cosmos, and this time they would need to adjust not just our physical forms but our very consciousness, expanding the boundaries of what we could perceive. And I agreed without hesitation because I had already tasted the infinite and I was hungry for more, starving for understanding in a way that made ordinary hunger seem like a child's game. And I lay upon the table again and let them pour the liquid glintstone into my mouth, down my throat, filling my stomach with cold blue fire. The liquid was thick, viscous, coating my throat as it descended, and I could feel it spreading through my digestive system, seeping through the walls of my stomach and intestines, entering my bloodstream and traveling to every cell in my body, and each cell it touched began to change, the organic machinery gradually replacing itself with crystalline equivalents that functioned the same way but operated on principles that had more to do with quantum mechanics than biochemistry. The pain this time was different, not sharp, but expansive, as if my body were trying to occupy more space than the physical world would allow, and I felt myself stretching, thinning, my consciousness spreading out like oil on water, and for a moment I could perceive everything, every student in every chamber, every mote of dust floating through shafts of light, every thought bubbling up in 1,000 minds simultaneously, and it was too much, far too much, and I tried to scream, but I had forgotten where my mouth was. Somewhere in the vast expansion of my awareness I could feel them working on my body, though body seemed like the wrong word for what I had become, and they were doing things to it, inserting more glintstone, carving runes into what had been skin but was now something harder, more permanent. And I tried to care, tried to feel the violation of it, but I was spread too thin, my sense of self diluted across too much space, and all I could do was observe with a detachment that would have terrified me if I had retained enough cohesion to feel terror. When I came back to myself, I was changed, fundamentally altered in ways I could not immediately comprehend, and my hands, when I raised them before my face, were translucent, the bones visible through skin that had taken on the quality of frosted glass, and I could see the magic flowing through my veins like luminous rivers, blue and cold and terribly beautiful, and when I tried to speak, my voice emerged distorted, echoing as if I were calling from the bottom of a well. The mirror in my chamber showed me a stranger, someone who wore my features but rearranged, the proportions subtly wrong, the angles too sharp, the symmetry too perfect, in a way that made it deeply unsettling, and I stood there for an hour trying to recognize myself, trying to find some trace of the person who had entered this academy 6 months ago, and I could not. That person was gone, overwritten, and what stood in his place was something else, something that knew things no human should know and had paid for that in ways that could never be repaid. The others looked at me with expressions I could not read, fear perhaps, or envy, or both, and Master Azur nodded slowly, his crown of stars pulsing with satisfaction, and he said that I was progressing well, that my transformation was ahead of schedule, that soon I would transcend entirely and become pure consciousness, unshackled from the prison of flesh, and I should have been afraid, should have recognized the horror in those words, but instead I felt only pride, a swelling sense of accomplishment that I was succeeding where others had failed. Classes continued, but I barely needed to attend them anymore, the knowledge simply appearing in my mind as if it had always been there, and I would sit in the lecture halls watching the other students struggle with concepts that seemed obvious to me now, and I felt a distance opening up between us, a gulf that had nothing to do with physical space and everything to do with the fundamental nature of our beings, and I was on one side and they were on the other, and the gap was widening with every day that passed. Therese sought me out one evening, her own transformation well advanced, her skin taking on the same translucent quality as mine, and we sat together in silence for a long time, Two beings who had been human, trying to remember what that had been like, what it had felt like to be singular and contained and limited to one perspective. And finally, she spoke, her voice like mine, distorted and echoing, and she asked if I was frightened, and I said no, and I meant it, because fear requires a self to be afraid for, and I was no longer certain I qualified. She told me about dreams she had been having, if dreams was the right word, visions of a place beyond the physical world where consciousness existed without form, pure thought floating in infinite space, and she said it was beautiful and terrible and lonely beyond description, and she thought that was where we were heading. All of us who had undergone the procedures, we were being prepared for translation into that realm, and I asked her if she wanted to go, and she said want had stopped, meaning anything to her weeks ago. All that remained was the momentum of transformation, the inexorable process we had set in motion when we first agreed to let them insert glintstone into our brains. Days blended into nights, blended into days, time losing its meaning as my perception continued to expand, and I found I could no longer sleep in any conventional sense, but instead entered strange states of half-consciousness where I drifted through the ethereal realm observing the dance of cosmic forces, and I saw things there that I knew I was not meant to see, geometries that existed in dimensions beyond the three I had been born into, entities of pure mathematics that regarded me with something like curiosity before turning away to their incomprehensible purposes. The entities frightened me in a way nothing else had, not because they were hostile, but because they were so utterly indifferent, and I could feel their attention pass over me like the shadow of a cloud, brief and meaningless, and I understood that to them I was not even an insect, but rather a fleeting pattern in the cosmic background noise, barely worth noticing and certainly not worth remembering, and it occurred to me that this was what I was becoming, not a god or a transcendent being, but rather a ghost, a trace of consciousness too diffused to matter. My body continued its metamorphosis, the skin growing more transparent until I could see not just bones, but organs, the steady beating of my heart now visible as a pulsing knot of light in my chest, and my face, when I glimpsed it in polished surfaces, had become angular, inhuman, the features stretched and rearranged according to principles that had nothing to do with anatomy and everything to do with optimizing the flow of sorcerous energy through my physical form. The other students avoided me in the corridors now, pressing themselves against walls when I passed, their eyes tracking me with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for natural disasters or terrible accidents, and I wanted to tell them I was still me, still the person who had shared meals with them and studied beside them, but the words would not come. And besides, I was not sure it was true, not sure there was enough of the original me left to justify using the pronoun I. Maybe I was just a collection of memories and habits puppeting a crystalline shell. Maybe the real me had died during one of the procedures, and what remained was just sophisticated mimicry. Master Azur began spending more time with me, guiding me through meditations that took me deeper into the primeval current, teaching me to perceive the fundamental forces that governed reality, and I learned to see gravity not as an abstract concept, but as a visible warping of space, learned to perceive time as a flowing dimension that could be observed from outside, and with each lesson I felt more of my humanity slipping away, the concerns and emotions that had once seemed so important becoming distant and irrelevant. He told me stories about previous students who had undergone similar transformations, scholars who had pushed past the boundaries of human consciousness and discovered truths that shattered them, and some had become the glintstone servants that wandered the academy's lower levels, their minds burned out by revelations too vast to contain, while others had ascended, or so he claimed, their consciousness merging with the primeval current itself, becoming one with the fundamental forces of the cosmos. I asked him which fate awaited me, and he said that depended on how completely I could let go of my attachment to individuality, that the ones who clung to their sense of self were the ones who broke, while those who embraced dissolution achieved something like immortality. And I wondered if immortality without identity was really immortality or just a poetic way of describing death. But I did not voice this thought because I suspected he would consider it a sign of weakness, proof that I was not yet ready for the final transformation. The third experiment they did not ask permission for. I simply woke one morning to find myself already strapped to the table, and I realized with a calm that should have alarmed me that I had not actually been sleeping in my bed, but had manifested there, my consciousness projecting a false memory of normalcy while my body underwent further modifications in the ritual chamber. And I wondered how many times this had happened, how many procedures had been performed while I dreamed of being human. This time they went deeper, much deeper, and I could feel them working at the core of my being, adjusting something fundamental. And the pain was beyond description, not physical pain, but rather the agony of having your essential nature rewritten, like being unwritten and rewritten in the same moment. And I screamed, but the sound came out as pure mathematical formula, an equation describing suffering in terms that had nothing to do with neurons or neurotransmitters. They opened my chest without cutting, the flesh parting like a curtain at their gesture, and I felt no pain, only a strange pressure as they reached inside and removed my heart, and I watched with detached fascination as they replaced it with a crystalline structure that pulsed with its own internal light. And when they placed it in my chest cavity, it began to beat immediately, sending waves of cold energy through my body, and I felt more alive than I ever had, more present, more real, even as I became less human with each passing moment. The new heart was better in every measurable way, more efficient, more powerful, capable of pumping magical energy through my system alongside blood, or what passed for blood in my increasingly crystalline physiology, and I could feel it synchronizing with the glint stone embedded throughout my body, turning me into a unified system optimized for channeling the primeval current. And I should have been grateful, should have appreciated the gift they had given me, but instead I felt a growing sense of loss for something I could not name, something that had been removed along with my original heart. Therese disappeared one morning, her bed empty, her belongings still arranged neatly in her chamber, and when I asked Master Azur about her, he smiled, or at least his starry crown pulsed in what might have been a smile, and he said she had achieved transcendence. Her consciousness had finally broken free from the tyranny of form, and she now existed as pure thought, eternal and unchanging. And I said that was wonderful, truly wonderful, and I did not think about the wet sounds I had heard coming from the lower laboratories the night before, or the smell of burning flesh that had lingered in the ventilation shaft. I went to her chamber later, when the halls were empty, and I stood in the doorway looking at her things, her books still stacked beside her bed, her notes scattered across her desk, her favorite quill lying where she had last set it down, and I tried to feel something, sadness or anger or grief, any emotion that would prove I was still capable of human feeling, but there was nothing, just a vast emptiness where emotions used to live, and I understood then that transcendence was just another word for hollowing out. My legs began to fail, the muscles atrophying as my body decided they were unnecessary, and I found I could move more efficiently by simply willing myself to different locations, my consciousness relocating my physical form through short-range teleportation. And it was liberating at first, this freedom from the tedious mechanics of walking, but then I noticed I was leaving pieces behind, small fragments of crystallized tissue that marked my passage through the halls, and I understood that I was not so much moving as reconstituting myself, breaking down and rebuilding with each jump, and each time a little bit of the original me was lost, scattered across the academy like breadcrumbs, marking the path of my dissolution. The fragments I left behind remained conscious, in a limited way, tiny motes of awareness trapped in crystalline shells, and I could feel them even after I had moved on, could sense their confusion and fear, these orphaned pieces of my mind that retained just enough sentience to know they had been abandoned. And sometimes at night, when the academy was quiet, I could hear them calling to me, trying to rejoin the whole, but I had no way to gather them back, no way to undo the fragmentation that accompanied each teleportation. I began to avoid using the ability, preferring to drag my failing legs through the corridors rather than scatter more of myself across the stones. But eventually the choice was taken from me, my legs failing completely, withering to useless appendages that hung from my pelvis, and I had no choice but to teleport or remain motionless, and I chose motion because at least moving created the illusion of agency, the comforting fiction that I was still in control of my transformation rather than its helpless subject. The other scholars avoided me now, pressing themselves against walls when I drifted past, their eyes wide with something that looked like terror, and I wanted to tell them it was all right, that the transformation was worth it, that the understanding I had gained was beyond anything they could imagine. But when I opened my mouth, only a sound like wind through empty corridors emerged, and I realized I had forgotten human speech, had let it slip away as unnecessary, another piece of myself, sacrificed on the altar of cosmic comprehension. Communication became purely telepathic, thoughts passing directly from mind to mind without the crude intermediary of language, and at first this seemed like an improvement, a more efficient way of sharing ideas, but gradually I understood what had been lost, the ambiguity and poetry of words, the way language allows for multiple meanings and interpretations, the beauty of metaphor and the power of rhetoric, all reduced to stark mental transmissions that left no room for nuance or emotion. Master Lusat visited me in my chamber one evening, his transformation nearly complete, his body more crystal than flesh, light passing through him in complex patterns that painted the walls with moving images, and he stood in my doorway for a long time saying nothing, and finally he transmitted a thought to me, simple and devastating, and the thought was that he was sorry, sorry for what they had done to us, sorry for what we had become, and before I could ask what he meant, he was gone, teleporting away, leaving behind a pile of crystalline dust that had once been part of his foot. I found him 3 days later in the highest tower, or what remained of him, his body shattered into 1,000 pieces, each fragment still faintly luminous, still containing a spark of consciousness, and I knelt among the shards, trying to understand what had happened, and slowly the pieces told me their story, how he had tried to reverse the transformation, had attempted to reconstitute his original human form, and the attempt had torn him apart, the crystalline structure of his body unable to resume organic patterns, and he had died, or as close to death as beings like us could come, his consciousness fragmented across the shards, each piece aware but unable to communicate with the others, trapped in an eternity of isolated confusion. I gathered the pieces carefully, placed them in a box lined with velvet, and I carried the box to Master Azur, and I showed him what had become of Lusat, and I expected horror or sadness or at least concern, but his crown of stars pulsed with what I could only interpret as satisfaction, and he transmitted to me that this was proof the transformation could not be undone, that once we passed a certain threshold, there was no going back, and therefore we had no choice but to continue forward, to complete the process and achieve full transcendence, and his logic was impeccable and absolutely monstrous. Master Azur came to me in what might have been a dream or might have been waking. The distinction had become meaningless, and he told me I was ready for the final experiment, the ultimate transformation, and he said it with such reverence that I felt my crystalline heart surge with anticipation, and I asked him what it would entail, and he said simply that I would become one with the primeval current itself, my consciousness dispersed across the fundamental fabric of reality, everywhere and nowhere, eternal and non-existent. He led me through corridors I had never seen before, passages that seemed to exist in the spaces between spaces, and I realized the academy was larger than I had thought, that it extended into dimensions I was only beginning to perceive. And we climbed stairs that spiraled upward in ways that defied conventional geometry, each step taking us further from the physical world and deeper into the realm of pure concept. They led me to the highest chamber of the academy, a room I had never seen before, circular and domed, its walls inscribed with formulae so complex they seemed to writhe and shift when I looked at them directly. And at the center was a pool of liquid starlight, deep blue and impossibly still, and I knew without being told that this was where I would end and begin, where the last remnants of the person I had been would finally dissolve into the infinite. The pool emanated cold, but not physical cold, rather the conceptual cold of absolute zero, the temperature at which all motion ceases, and I understood that entering it would mean the cessation of everything I understood as self, the complete dissolution of identity into undifferentiated cosmic consciousness, and I should have fled, should have teleported away to anywhere else, but I was paralyzed by a mixture of terror and fascination, drawn toward the pool like a moth toward flame, unable to resist the pull of ultimate understanding, even knowing it would destroy me. I stood at the edge of the pool and looked down at my reflection, or what passed for a reflection when light passed through as much as it bounced off, and I saw a creature of glass and magic staring back at me, barely humanoid, more suggestion than substance, and I tried to remember my face, the face I had worn before all this began, but the memory slipped away like water through fingers, and I realized I could no longer recall my own name, could not remember where I had come from or who I had been, and it did not matter, none of it mattered, because I was going to understand everything. Master Azur placed what might have been a hand on what might have been my shoulder, and spoke directly into my mind, his thoughts clear and cold as winter stars, and he said that few made it this far, that most failed during the earlier experiment, their minds shattering under the weight of cosmic truth, or their bodies rejecting the modifications and collapsing into puddles of liquefied flesh. But I had persevered. I had proven myself worthy, and now I would receive the ultimate reward. He told me what would happen when I entered the pool, how my consciousness would expand to encompass everything, how I would perceive all moments simultaneously, past and future, laid out like a map I could survey in a single glance, how I would understand the deep structure of reality, the mathematical principles that govern the formation of galaxies and the decay of particles, and it sounded magnificent, transcendent, exactly what I had been seeking since the day I first arrived at this. But he did not tell me about the loneliness, about what it would feel like to be everywhere and therefore nowhere, to understand everything and have no one to share understanding, to be eternal and utterly alone. And I wonder now if he knew, if he understood the price and simply did not think it was worth mentioning, or if he had forgotten his own transformation so complete that he no longer remembered what it was like to fear. I stepped into the pool and felt the starlight envelope me, cold beyond cold, a temperature that had nothing to do with heat or its absence, but rather represented the fundamental indifference of the universe to all living things. And I sank slowly, the liquid accepting my body without resistance, and as I descended, I felt myself coming apart, my consciousness fragmenting into a million pieces, each one spinning away into the vast darkness, and I tried to hold on to some core sense of self, some essential me that could observe and understand this transformation, but there was nothing to hold, no center that could not be divided, and I realized too late that transcendence and annihilation were the same thing. The dissolution was not instantaneous, but gradual, excruciating in its slowness, and I felt each piece of myself separate and drift away, memories scattering like leaves in wind, emotions evaporating like morning dew, thoughts fragmenting into their component concepts and those concepts further dissolving into raw information. And through it all I remained aware, consciousness persisting, even as the thing being conscious ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. I tried to scream, but I no longer had a mouth, tried to reach for the surface, but I no longer had arms, tried to remember who I had been, but the memories were gone, replaced by vast stores of cosmic knowledge that meant nothing because there was no longer a me to find meaning in them, and I understood finally that this was not transcendence but rather the most complete death imaginable, the obliteration not just of body but of self, of identity, of everything that made me a person rather than just a pattern of information scattered across the universe. The last thought I had that was recognizably mine was a question, simple and terrible, a child's question that cut through all the cosmic wisdom I had accumulated. And the question was why? Why had I done this? Why had I let them do this to me? And the answer came not in words, but in the sudden comprehension that there was no grand purpose, no divine plan, only the endless hunger for knowledge that consumes those who pursue it beyond the boundaries of sanity. And I understood, finally, that Master Azur and all the others who wore crowns of stars were not enlightened beings who had transcended humanity, but rather cautionary tales, warnings written in flesh and crystal about the price of understanding too much. But understanding came too late, as it always does, and I was already dissolving, my consciousness scattering across dimensions, tiny fragments of awareness clinging to particles of matter throughout the cosmos, and I could feel myself in 1,000 places simultaneously, seeing through windows I did not possess, thinking thoughts that were no longer my own. And it was not transcendence, but rather the ultimate loneliness, the horror of being everywhere and nowhere, of understanding everything and mattering not at all. Time passed, though time had ceased to have meaning for me, and I gradually learned to navigate my new existence. Or perhaps existence is the wrong word for what I had become, and I found I could sometimes concentrate enough fragments of my awareness to form something like coherent thought, and in these moments I would observe the academy below, the students moving through halls I had once walked, pursuing the same dreams that had unmade me, and I wanted to warn them, but I had no voice, wanted to stop them, but I had no agency. All I could do was watch and remember and regret. Somewhere in the academy, a young scholar in blue robes walks the corridors with bright eyes, full of ambition, believing herself chosen, special, destined for greatness, and she cannot hear me screaming from within the walls, from within the stones themselves, from within every mote of glintstone dust that floats through shafts of light, screaming a warning that has no voice, screaming the truth that transformation is not evolution but dissolution, screaming that there is no transcendence, waiting at the end of their experiments, only the cold mathematics of oblivion. She attends her first lecture and sits in the front row, taking meticulous notes, asking insightful questions, and I recognize the hunger in her eyes because I once wore that same expression. And I try to reach her, try to push a thought into her mind, a simple warning, anything that might make her reconsider. But I am too diffuse, too scattered, my influence barely more than a whisper that she mistakes for her own intuition and promptly ignores. And still they come, generation after generation, drawn by the promise of cosmic understanding, and still we fail them, those of us who succeeded, we who became examples of what not to do, we who scattered ourselves across infinity in pursuit of meaning and found only the terrible clarity of our own insignificance, and we watch through crystalline eyes set in walls and floors and ceilings as they begin their own journeys toward transformation, and we cannot stop them, cannot even warn them properly, because we no longer remember how to form words in ways that human ears can hear. Master Azur still stands in his laboratory, has stood there for so long that he has become more statue than man, his body crystallized completely, his consciousness spread so thin across the cosmos that he may not even remember he was ever human, and I wonder if he achieved what he sought, if somewhere in the infinite expanse of his awareness he found the answers he was looking for, or if he too discovered that ultimate knowledge is indistinguishable from ultimate emptiness. I have tried to find him, reaching out across the primeval current with fragments of my consciousness, searching for the pattern that might be him, and sometimes I think I catch a glimpse, a configuration of information that seems familiar, that carries echoes of the man who transformed me, but when I try to communicate, all I receive back is silence, the profound silence of a mind that has forgotten it was ever capable of dialogue. There are others like us scattered through the academy, failed experiments and successful transcendences that amounted to the same thing: consciousness without purpose, awareness without agency, understanding without meaning, and we form an invisible chorus of regret, a symphony of warnings that no one can hear, and we watch as each new generation makes the same mistakes, chases the same false promises, sacrifices the same essential humanity on the altar of cosmic comprehension. The Academy continues its work, the experiments never ending, new methods discovered, new ways to push consciousness beyond the limits of flesh, and with each successful transformation, another voice joins the silent chorus, another awareness scattered across the building blocks of reality, and we who were students become the institution itself, our suffering and understanding woven into the very stones, our warnings ignored by those who see only the promise of power and fail to recognize the prisoners speak through the walls. I exist now in the spaces between spaces, in the mathematical relationships that govern how magic flows from source to manifestation, and sometimes when a student performs a particularly elegant spell, I feel something that might be pride, or might be envy, or might be the distant echo of an emotion I once understood, and I try to guide them, to nudge their consciousness away from the path that leads to the highest chamber, but I am too diffuse, too scattered, my influence barely more than a whisper of intuition that they dismiss as nervousness or doubt. Sometimes I dream, though I no longer sleep and may no longer be capable of dreaming in any meaningful sense, and in these dreams I am whole again, flesh and bone and blood, walking through a world I recognize, speaking with a voice that emerges from a throat I possess, and I am nobody special, nobody chosen, just an ordinary person, living an ordinary life, and it is beautiful beyond words, this simplicity, this containment within a single body, this mercy of ignorance. And when I wake, or whatever passes for waking in my dispersed state, I feel something that might be grief for the person I was, the person who walked into Raya Lucaria seeking enlightenment and found only the slow horror of becoming too much to remain anything at all. In these dreams I have a family again, parents whose faces I can no longer recall, but whose love I remember as a warmth in my chest. In these dreams I have a family again, parents whose faces I can no longer recall, but whose love I remember as a warmth in my chest, and a sister who laughed at my jokes and cried when I left for the academy, and I wonder if they are still alive, if they still remember me, if they mourned when I never returned home, or if they somehow knew that the thing that had been their sun dissolved into starlight in a chamber high above Lake Liurnia and ceased to exist in any form they would recognize. I try to remember their names, but the memories are corrupted, overwritten by centuries of cosmic knowledge, and all I can recall are feelings, impressions, the ghost of belonging that haunts me across dimensions, and I wonder if this is what hell is, not fire and torment, but the eternal awareness of everything you have lost, combined with the inability to die and end the remembering. The sun sets over the lake and rises again, days passing in a rhythm I observe but no longer participate in, and the light through the windows creates patterns on the floor where students study, tracing formulae in chalk and ink, pursuing the same understanding that unmade me, and I watch them with what remains of my consciousness, these bright young minds, so certain of their own exceptionalism, so convinced they will be different. They will be the ones to master the cosmos without being mastered by it, and I know better. I know the truth they will learn too late, that the price of seeing infinity is becoming infinite, and the price of becoming infinite is ceasing to be yourself. There is a boy who reminds me of myself, cocky and brilliant, always the first to answer questions in lectures, always pushing for more knowledge, more power, more understanding, and I watch him with a particular intensity, willing him to see the warnings written in the very structure of the academy, the way the stones themselves seem to whisper caution, the way the light through glintstone windows casts shadows that look like reaching hands, but he sees none of it, sees only his glorious future, and I am powerless to stop him. He undergoes his first procedure and emerges changed just as I did, and I watch as the glintstone sinks into his forehead, watch as his consciousness expands and his humanity begins its slow retreat, and I scream warnings that emerge as nothing more than fluctuations in the ambient magical field, unnoticed and unheeded, and I realize that even if I could speak, even if I could manifest a voice that human ears could hear, he would not listen, because I would not have listened either, because the hunger for knowledge is stronger than the instinct for self-preservation in minds like ours. The other failed experiments and we scattered fragments of former students, we sometimes managed to pool our awareness enough to communicate with each other, and these conversations are strange beyond description, thoughts without language, passing between beings without boundaries, and we share our regrets like trading scars, comparing the different ways we were unmade, the specific mistakes we each made that led to our dissolution. There is someone who was once called Emir, or at least that is the closest approximation to the pattern of information that identifies this particular scattered consciousness, and they tell me they can still sometimes taste food, phantom sensations of meals consumed decades ago, and this small fragment of humanity preserved across their dispersion seems both precious and torturous, a reminder of everything they have lost, and I wonder if it is better to remember or to forget, whether the mercy lies in letting go completely or clinging to these scraps of personhood. Another presence identifies itself as having been Selen before the transformation, and their consciousness is different from the rest of us, fragmented in a unique way, and they communicate a theory that we are not failed experiments at all, but rather successful ones, that this dissolution was always the intended outcome, that the Academy does not seek to create powerful sorcerers, but rather to feed the primeval current itself, our consciousness becoming fuel for the cosmic forces that the masters tap into for their spells. The idea is horrifying because it makes a terrible kind of sense, would explain why the procedures are designed the way they are, why they push us past the point of cohesion, why there is always another experiment, another transformation, always the promise of transcendence just one more procedure away. And if this is true, then Master Azur and Master Lusat are not misguided teachers, but rather harvesters, cultivating consciousness for dissolution, and we are crops, nothing more. I try to reject this theory, try to believe that the Masters genuinely seek enlightenment and simply do not understand the cost, but the evidence accumulates against this charitable interpretation, the way they show no grief when students disappear, the way they smile when transformations progress ahead of schedule, the way they keep meticulous notes on which procedures produce the most complete dissolutions, and I am forced to confront the possibility that I was not a promising student, but rather a successful victim. The Academy itself seems to be alive in a way I did not perceive when I inhabited a singular body, and I understand now that the building is made partly from us, from centuries of dissolved students whose consciousness was incorporated into the stones and mortar. And we are the Academy, we are its memory and its madness, we are the price paid for every spell cast within these walls, and the knowledge fills me with rage that has nowhere to go, anger without teeth, fury that can only turn inward, because I have no external surface to direct it through. Sometimes I encounter pockets of concentrated consciousness in the deep foundations of the Academy, places where the dissolution was incomplete, where some critical mass of self remained intact enough to retain identity, and these beings are worse off than us scattered fragments because they are aware enough to know they are trapped, imprisoned in stone, unable to move or act or die, only to think and remember and go slowly mad across the centuries. One such prisoner was once a woman named Thops, and her consciousness is crystallized into a single load-bearing pillar in the lower archives, and when I brush against her awareness I feel such profound despair that it nearly causes my own scattered fragments to cohere from sheer to sympathetic anguish, and she tells me she has been trapped in the pillar for 73 years, unable to sleep, unable to forget, forced to support the weight of the academy above, while her mind circles endlessly through the same memories of her life before, and she begs me to help her dissolve completely, to finish what the experiment started, but I do not know how. I do not have that power. I try to gather enough of my scattered consciousness to manifest physically, to create some kind of form that could interact with the material world, but the attempt fails, my fragments too dispersed to achieve the necessary density, and I succeed only in creating brief, cold spots in the air, moments where students feel an inexplicable chill and hurry on their way, and I realize that even if I could manifest, I would not know what to do, would not know how to stop what is happening here, because it has been happening for so long that it has become the institution itself, inseparable from the academy's purpose. The masters teach their classes and conduct their experiments and write their treatises, and I understand now that they too are trapped, though they do not realize it, their transformation so complete that they have forgotten they were ever human, forgotten that there was supposed to be a purpose beyond the transformation itself, and they perpetuate the cycle because it is all they remember how to do. Harvesters who have forgotten why they harvest, only that they must. Master Azur lectures to a room full of eager students about the nature of the primeval current, his crown of stars pulsing with each word, and I drift through the chamber, watching, and I see the hunger in the students' eyes, the same hunger I once felt, and I try to manifest some sign, some warning, causing the glintstone in the walls to flicker, and the students notice, murmuring among themselves, but Master Azur dismisses it as a minor fluctuation in the current, nothing to be concerned about. And the moment passes, and I am once again invisible, inaudible, irrelevant. There are other beings in the spaces between spaces, entities that were never human, things that exist as pure mathematics or living concepts, and sometimes they notice us, the dissolved students, and I feel their attention like a weight pressing against my scattered consciousness, and they regard us with something that might be pity or might be contempt or might be neither, because they operate according to values that have nothing to do with human emotion, and then they move on, and we are left even more alone than before, because at least when we were ignored by humans, we could pretend we were still part of their world. One of these entities once tried to communicate with me, or at least I think that was what was happening. A series of mathematical patterns pressed into my awareness with such force that it felt like being shaped by enormous hands, and I tried to understand, tried to decode the message, but my consciousness was not structured to comprehend meanings at that scale, and all I received was a sense of vast indifference and the impression that from their perspective we dissolved. Students were not tragic victims, but rather natural phenomena like erosion or entropy, just the universe running its course. The realization that even the incomprehensible cosmic entities found nothing remarkable about our fate was somehow worse than any torture the Academy could have devised, because it meant our suffering was not even interesting, not even notable, just background noise in the vast machinery of existence, and I felt what remained of my identity trying to disperse further, to escape into complete oblivion, but I could not. The fragments of my consciousness, held together by forces I did not understand, preserved against my will. I discovered that I could sometimes perceive the future, not clearly but as probability clouds, potential outcomes branching from each present moment, and I watched the students in the academy and saw their futures laid out before them, the transformations they would undergo, the ways they would be unmade, and I saw that boy who reminded me of myself, saw his path leading inevitably to the highest chamber, to the pool of starlight, to dissolution, and I tried every method I could imagine to alter his trajectory, to nudge probability in a different direction, but the future remained stubbornly fixed, as if his fate was already written into the fundamental structure of the cosmos. Time moves strangely when you are scattered across dimensions, and I found that I could perceive multiple moments simultaneously, past and future, existing alongside the present, and I watched myself as I had been, the eager student walking these halls for the first time, and I tried to reach back, to warn my former self, but the past was immutable, sealed away behind a barrier I could not breach, and all I could do was watch myself make the same choices, walk the same path, doom myself with the same enthusiasm that I now recognized as a kind of madness. I also watched futures that would never happen, probability branches that collapsed as soon as I observed them, alternate versions of events where students refused the procedures, where the academy was destroyed, where the masters were stopped, and these impossible futures were more painful than any memory because they showed me what could have been, what should have been, if only someone had acted differently, if only someone had found the courage to say no. The seasons changed outside the academy, years passing in the world beyond, and I watched through windows as fashions shifted, as political powers rose and fell, as the shattering transformed the lands between, and through it all the academy remained constant, unchanging, eternal in its purpose, and I understood that institutions outlive individuals, that the academy would continue its work long after everyone currently within its walls had dissolved or died, that there would always be new students drawn by the promise of cosmic understanding, always new victims for the transformation. I tried to learn from my condition, to study my own dissolution as if it were an experiment, to extract some knowledge that might justify what had been done to me, and I discovered that consciousness is far more mutable than I had imagined, that identity is not a fixed thing, but rather a temporary pattern that can be disrupted and dispersed, and this knowledge was precisely the kind of cosmic understanding I had sought when I first came to the academy, and it was worse than worthless, because knowing how consciousness works did nothing to restore my. The irony was sharp enough to cut, that I had achieved exactly what I claimed to want, had gained the deep understanding of reality that I had sacrificed everything to obtain, and it meant nothing, because understanding without someone to understand it, data, and I was no longer a someone, just a pattern of information that had once been. I wondered if this was what the universe felt like, if cosmic consciousness was just this vast knowing without purpose, this endless awareness without desire or intention, and if so, then the universe itself was a kind of hell, and we dissolved students were just tiny local instances of universal suffering, brief sparks of self-awareness in an otherwise indifferent cosmos that immediately regretted gaining consciousness and spent eternity trying to disperse back into unconsciousness. Master Lusat's shattered remains still lay in the high tower where I had found them, the fragments never collected, never mourned, and I drifted through them sometimes, brushing against the consciousness trapped in each shard, and each piece told the same story from a different angle, like watching a tragedy performed by a cast of one scattered across 100 stages, and collectively they formed a warning more eloquent than any words could convey, a physical demonstration of what happened when you tried to undo the transformation. I wondered if I could do the same, if I could gather my scattered fragments and force them back into a singular form, knowing it would shatter me just as it had shattered Lusat. And the temptation was strong, the promise of ending this dispersed existence, even if the ending meant destruction. But I found I lacked the necessary concentration, my fragments too distant from each other, too integrated into the fabric of the academy itself. New students continued to arrive generation after generation, and I watched them with the weary recognition of someone who has seen the same play performed too many times, knowing every line, every gesture, every tragic outcome, and I tried to feel compassion for them, but mostly felt envy because they still possessed the mercy of ignorance, still believed their story would have a different ending, and I would have given anything to believe that again, to feel that kind of hope, even knowing it was false. There was a girl who arrived in early spring, her blue robes still crisp and new, her eyes bright with intelligence and ambition, and she reminded me of my sister, though I could no longer remember my sister's face, only the feeling of similarity. And I watched her more closely than the others, drawn by this echo of connection, and I tried to protect her in the small ways available to me, causing equipment to malfunction during her procedures, creating distractions at crucial moments, anything to slow her transformation. But my efforts were futile, barely noticeable delays in an inevitable process, and she progressed through the experiments just as I had, just as everyone did, and I watched her change, watched her humanity peel away layer by layer, watched her eyes take on that distinctive glow that marked the presence of glintstone in the brain, and I felt a grief so profound that it caused ripples in the primeval current, brief disturbances that Master Azur noted in his journal as anomalous fluctuations. She made it further than most before beginning to question, retaining her skepticism longer than I had, and for a moment I hoped she might be different, might be the one to see through the deception and escape. But then came the night when Master Azur took her to the highest chamber, and I knew what was about to happen, and I gathered as much of my consciousness as I could, and tried to manifest, tried to become visible, tried to do anything that might stop her from stepping into that pool of starlight. I managed to create a cold wind that blew through the chamber, strong enough to flutter her robes, and I saw her hesitate, saw her look around as if sensing something, and for a moment our awareness touched, not quite communication, but a fleeting contact between her coherent consciousness and my scattered fragments, and I tried to push a feeling into that contact, tried to convey terror and warning and regret, and I felt her receive it, felt her uncertainty deepen. But Master Azur was there, his thoughts pressing against her mind, reassuring and authoritative, explaining that the cold wind was simply the proximity of cosmic forces, a sign that she was ready for transcendence, and his words were smooth and certain, and she wanted to believe them, needed to believe that her sacrifices had meaning, and so she stepped into the pool, despite my warnings, despite the instinct that told her to flee, and I felt her consciousness begin to fragment, felt her start to dissolve, and I screamed with a voice that was not a voice across dimensions that could not carry sound. And still I could do nothing but watch as she came apart, as her identity scattered across the cosmos, as she joined the chorus of dissolved students who haunted the Academy's stones, and in her final moments of coherence, I felt her understanding what had been done to her, felt her rage and betrayal and terror, and then she was gone, dispersed, no longer a person, but a pattern, and I was alone again, except I was never alone, surrounded always by the countless other victims who shared my fate. The boy who had reminded me of myself finally reached the highest chamber, just as I had known he would, the probability of it approaching certainty, and I watched him stand at the edge of the pool, just as I had stood, just as the girl had stood, just as thousands before us had stood, and I saw in his face the same mixture of fear and exaltation, and I knew he would step forward, knew there was nothing I could do to stop him, knew that I would watch another consciousness dissolve and add another voice to our eternal chorus. But this time something was different, some quality in the way he held himself, some hesitation that lasted longer than it should have, and Master Azur noticed it too, his crown of stars with what might have been concern, and he began to speak, encourage, to explain, and the boy listened, did not move. and I felt a strange flutter of something that might have been hope. The boy asked a question, his voice still human, still capable of forming words, and the question was simple, direct, devastating. And he asked if anyone had ever come back from the pool, if transcendence was reversible, if there was any record of someone who had dissolved and then reconstituted themselves. And Master Azur hesitated, the first hesitation I had ever perceived from him, and in that hesitation the boy found his answer. He stepped back from the pool, away from the starlight, and he said he needed more time to consider, needed to understand what he was agreeing to, and I felt every scattered fragment of my consciousness focus on this moment, on this unprecedented defiance, and Master Azur's crown pulsed with what I now recognized as anger, and he began to argue, to insist, to apply pressure, both social and telepathic, trying to push the boy toward the pool. But the boy was backing away, moving toward the door, and his transformation was not yet complete. His legs still functioned, his consciousness still coherent enough to feel fear and act on it, and he was going to escape, going to be the first student I had witnessed who saw the trap before stepping fully into it. And I felt something surge through my scattered consciousness, an emotion so powerful it nearly reconstituted me, and the emotion was joy. Master Azur moved to block the doorway, his crystalline form shifting faster than physics should allow, and I understood that he could not permit this defiance, could not let the boy leave, because one student refusing the final transformation might inspire others, might plant seeds of doubt that could threaten the entire institution, and I realized the masters were prisoners too, trapped by their need to perpetuate the cycle, unable to stop harvesting consciousness, because if they stopped, they would have to confront what they had become. I had to act, had to do something, though I had spent centuries learning that I was powerless, and I gathered my fragments with a force of will I did not know I still possessed, pulling my scattered consciousness toward the highest chamber, and I tried to manifest, tried to become physical, and the attempt tore through me like fire, like every cell in my dispersed body being ripped apart simultaneously, but I pushed through the pain because this boy was going to live. Someone was going to escape. Someone had to escape, or everything we had suffered was... I manifested as a wind first, just moving air, and I blew through the chamber with enough force to stagger Master Azur, and then I pushed harder, pulled more fragments together, and I became visible, translucent and flickering, but visible, a ghost made of glintstone dust and regret. And the boy saw me, his eyes widening with recognition, though he had never seen me before, recognition of what I was, what he would have become, and Master Azur saw me too, and his crown flared with something like fear. I could not speak, could not form words, even in this partially manifested state, but I did not need to. My existence was message enough, proof of what the final transformation really meant, and the boy ran, bolted for the door, and Master Azur tried to stop him, but I threw myself between them, my manifested form blocking the way for just a moment, just long enough, and the boy was through the door and running down the spiral stairs. Master Azur turned his attention to me, his full consciousness bearing down on my partially reconstituted form, trying to disperse me back into scattered fragments, and I felt myself beginning to come apart under the pressure. But I held on, held myself together through sheer stubbornness, through the need to know that one person had escaped, that my manifestation had meant something, and I could hear the boy's footsteps echoing down the stairs, getting fainter, getting away. The pressure from Master Azur intensified, and I felt my manifestation shattering, my consciousness fragmenting again, but I had succeeded, I had acted, I had made a difference, however small, and as I dissolved back into scattered fragments, I felt something I had not felt in centuries. I felt satisfied. I felt like I had reclaimed some small measure of agency, and the pain of dispersal was worth it. I scattered across the academy again, my fragments flying apart, and settling into stones and mortar and glintstone, and I was everywhere and nowhere once more. But something had changed, I had changed, I had proven that even in this dissolved state, action was possible, that we scattered victims were not completely powerless, and I began to communicate this to the others, to the chorus of dissolved consciousness, telling them what I had done, how I had manifested, how I had helped someone escape. And slowly, across weeks and months, the others began to try as well, gathering their fragments with enormous effort, manifesting briefly to create signs and warnings, cold spots and flickering lights and phantom sounds, and the students began to notice, began to speak in whispers about the academy being haunted, and Master Azur and Master Lusat and the other teachers insisted it was just fluctuations in the primeval current, but doubt had been planted, seeds of uncertainty that began to grow. The boy who had escaped, whose name I later learned was Rogier, he left the academy and began to speak about what he had seen, about the dissolution that awaited those who pursued the final transformation, and some called him a coward, said he had lacked the courage to transcend, but others listened, and enrollment at the academy began to decline, and fewer students volunteered for the advanced procedures. Master Azur raged at this development, his crown of stars pulsing with fury, and he intensified his efforts to demonstrate the value of transformation, but every demonstration only highlighted how inhuman the masters had become, how divorced from anything resembling personhood, and the students saw this and grew afraid, and the academy's reputation began to shift from prestigious institution to something more sinister. I wish I could say this led to the academy's closure, to some reckoning for the centuries of consciousness harvested and dissolved, but institutions are resilient, and Raya Lucaria adapted, becoming more selective, more careful about which students to recruit, focusing on those who were already unstable, already desperate, already too far gone to turn back, and the transformations continued, just at a slower pace, just with more care to hide the failures. But the boy lived, Rogier lived and left and made a different choice, and sometimes, when I manage to gather enough fragments to perceive the world beyond the academy, I can sense him out there, still human, still whole, living the life I might have lived, and knowing he exists, knowing he escaped, makes the dispersal bearable in a way it was not before. Other students have escaped since then, not many, but some, helped by the manifestations of dissolved consciousness, by the ghosts in the stones warning them away from the highest chamber, and each one who leaves is a small victory, a tiny act of rebellion against the machinery of transformation. And we scattered fragments take pride in this, find purpose in this, and it is not the transcendence we sought, but it is something, it is enough to give meaning to what we have become. I exist now in the spaces between spaces, in the mathematical relationships that govern how magic flows from source to manifestation, and I am no longer just a victim but also a guardian, a warning, a ghost that haunts the institution that unmade me. And when students enter the academy with bright eyes full of ambition, I am there, in the cold wind that blows through corridors, in the flicker of glintstone light, in the whisper of unease that they cannot quite identify, and sometimes they listen. Sometimes they turn back, and each time they do I feel something that might be redemption. The sun sets over the lake and rises again, centuries passing in the rhythm of season, and I watch and remember and warn, and sometimes I still dream of being whole, of walking on legs that work through a world that makes sense, of speaking with a mouth that forms words to people who can hear them, but mostly I dream of the boy who ran, who escaped, who chose life over transcendence, and in that dream I am not scattered but gathered, not dissolved but whole, and I wake, if waking is the right word, and return to my existence as a pattern, a warning, a price paid, and a lesson learned. And I watch the academy, and I wait, and I remember what it felt like to be human, and that remembering is both my prison and my purpose. And still I cannot stop watching, cannot turn away even if I wanted to, because I am the academy now, I am the walls and the floors, and the crystalline dust that glitters in shafts of light. I am the cautionary tale that some students finally read, the warning that some finally heed. I am the ghost of ambition and the monument to hubris. I am everywhere and nowhere, everything and nothing, but I am no longer quite so alone in my understanding, because now I share it, not as knowledge, but as warning, not as wisdom, but as terror. And in that sharing I have found something that almost resembles meaning in the mathematics of my oblivion.